In this video discussion, we'll take a look at Chapter 6, which explores learning. And more specifically, we're going to take a look at the various types of learning and the various different ways that learning actually occurs. So first of all, let's get a definition of learning. So learning basically is a relatively enduring change in behavior or knowledge as a result of experience. And then also we're going to take a look at, well, okay, so learning has to do with experience, but we want to start taking a look at some of the different types of experience that results in learning. So one of these that we'll start with is what's known as conditioning. And that's basically the process of learning associations between environmental events and behavioral responses. So if that's not really clear to you yet, don't worry. Just kind of stick with us here and we will actually explore that a little more in depth here as we proceed. So there are three types of conditioning. There's what's known as classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning. So we'll begin by taking a look at classical conditioning. So classical conditioning basically involves repeatedly pairing a neutral stimulus with a response-producing stimulus until the neutral stimulus elicits the same response. So that's kind of a long definition there that I think I can simplify for you. And the best way to learn this is actually through example. So first of all, before we proceed, just I wanted to make you aware that this researcher right here, Ivan Pavlov, he is usually associated with the discovery of what's known as classical conditioning. So let's start taking a look at this a little bit more in depth here. So first of all, Pavlov, I kind of refer to him, in my simple ways of remembering things, but I refer to him as the salivating dog guy, But so what he did is in his labs, he had dogs. And he noticed that as he was about ready to feed them each day, that he noticed they would start salivating as soon as, the dog food was prepared. And that got Pavlov thinking, well, what would happen is if I basically had another stimulus right before I presented the dog food. So in this example, the stimulus was a ringing bell. So basically what Pavlov would do is would ring the bell a couple seconds before presenting the dog food. And then he did that repeatedly. And that resulted in a type of conditioning, what we call classical conditioning. And Pavlov noticed that, well, as the dog was conditioned to respond to the sound of the ringing bell, that it actually would not even require dog food, and it would start salivating to the sound of the ringing bell. Okay, so that is a good example of classical conditioning. Now, there are a few terms here on the left-hand side, though, we do have to become aware of. And they are these right here. And we're going to start with unconditioned stimulus. So basically, unconditioned stimulus in this example was the dog food. Okay, so condition, you can also think of that as, you can kind of refer to it as sort of trained, so the dog didn't have to be trained to respond to the dog food. So that's why it was called unconditioned stimulus. And then the same thing when the dog was, saw the dog food, it would start salivating. Well, that was naturally occurring. It did not have to be trained or conditioned to salivate to the dog food. It was naturally occurring. And so that is what's known as unconditioned response. So right here, the dog food, is the stimulus. It was unconditioned. And then the dog salivating was the unconditioned response, the naturally occurring response. Okay, then conditioned stimulus right here, is actually the sound of the ringing bell right here. Okay, and so the dog was slowly becoming conditioned to respond, to salivate to the sound of the bell. But first, the Pavlov, he had to continuously pair the sound of the ringing bell with the dog food so the dog would actually make that association between the two. And eventually, after enough repetition, the dog would start to salivate to the sound of the bell without the dog food being present. And so that became the sound of the ringing bell became a conditioned stimulus right here. And then the conditioned response, he was trained to respond to the sound of the ringing bell. And so that's why it's called conditioned response. Okay, so I hope that's clear. So if this is a little confusing, I definitely recommend that you pause the video, rewind it, and view this until you start to understand what these terms actually refer to. Okay, so there's a few different types of factors, that can affect conditioning. There's what's known as stimulus generalization. Okay, so basically that is not only responding to the learned response, and the original stimulus, but actually learning to respond to similar stimuli as well. So I know that sounds kind of a little complicated, but if you look at this picture right here, you see that the baby actually is crying because it is feeling the shot, but it's also learning it's to respond eventually to the visual observation of a nurse or a doctor with a white coat coming in, and so the baby will eventually start to, whenever it sees somebody in a white coat or something, actually start to generalize, saying, oh, that means I'm going to get hurt again. I'm going to get that, the needle in my arm again or something. And it's going to automatically, have a negative reaction toward, to seeing somebody coming in, like the nurse or the doctor. So that is called stimulus generalization. And so it's basically the baby, is generalizing, So I hope that makes sense. I'm going to move forward here. So stimulus discrimination, on the other hand, that's the occurrence of a learned response to a specific stimulus, but not to other similar stimuli. Okay, so so that's just more specific. Okay, and then there's what's known as higher order conditioning. So I highly recommend you pause the video and read these definitions right here. But higher order conditioning, all that means is a second conditioning can occur. So take, for instance, if I just make an example. If you remember in Pavlov's dog conditioning, the dog eventually became conditioned to the sound of a ringing bell. But then what would happen, Pavlov, experimented a little further and said, well, what would happen if the dog is already conditioned to respond to the sound of a ringing bell, but without the original stimulus, which was the dog food, if you remember. Okay, But what if every time right before I ring the bell, I might have the sound of a metronome? A metronome is, the thing that musicians use. It makes a clicking sound. Okay. So eventually the dog would start to associate the sound of the metronome with the ringing bell. And then eventually the dog would start to salivate to the sound of the metronome without having to to respond to the ringing bell, if that makes sense. So it was a second conditioning that occurred, and that's what's known as higher order conditioning. So I think, thinking about those examples is a quicker, easier way to learn exactly what these terms mean. And when it comes to conditioning, it was determined that conditioning is definitely most effective if the conditioned stimulus is presented right before, usually within half a second to a couple seconds or a few seconds, right before the unconditioned stimulus. So that's why, the sound of the ringing bell was usually presented, within a couple seconds right before the dog was fed the dog food. Okay, so there's a couple terms I want to make you aware of here. The first one is called extinction. So during classical conditioning, take for instance, the dog, was constantly, heard without the dog food, but heard the, sound of the ringing bell. And but without the dog food, eventually that conditioning would get weaker. And so, and it would seem like the conditioning, was possibly had disappeared. But actually, what that is called, that process getting weaker, is called extinction. But it was found, though, that it actually didn't disappear forever, and it would reappear eventually over a period of time. And that was what's called spontaneous recovery. So it would show back up again. All right. So I just want to make you aware of this researcher right here named Watson. And Watson, as he started looking at Pavlov's, studies on conditioning, Watson took a little further and said, well, look, basically, I feel that, all human behavior is the result of conditioning and learning. So all human behavior is the result of those two things. And so that's why Watson is accredited with founding the new approach called behaviorism. So all behavior is the result of conditioning and learning. Then contemporary psychologists, specifically this individual, John Garcia, said, look, all behavior can't be is a result of conditioning and learning. There's actually some behavior that is naturally occurring. And so actually, the term for that naturally occurring behavior is what's known as biological preparedness. So that is when an organism is innately predisposed to form associations between certain stimuli and responses. So take, for instance, I'll just give you an example. There's take, for instance, when one will see something like a snake or a spider walking toward them or being very close to them, one will actually, have a fearful type reaction, generally speaking. And that is innately innately occurring. It is we are innately predisposed because of our biological conditioning. Through evolution, some psychologists have said, look, we have that innate reaction because through our evolution, we learned that those types of organisms can be a threat to us. Okay, so that concludes our look at classical conditioning, but now we're going to take a look at what's known as operant conditioning. And so that is learning to associate behavior with consequences. So remember, classical conditioning was concerned with behavior and definitely, like stimuli and everything. Whereas operant conditioning is concerned with behavior and its consequences. So here is the formal definition right here of operant conditioning: with the learning of active voluntary behaviors that are shaped and maintained by their consequences. And I put that in red because that's what's really important. So I'll give you an example here. Okay. Take, for instance, as students, some of you may set a goal and say, look, I would like to, in all my classes this semester, I would like to finish with the grade of A. I'd like to get a 4.0 GPA this semester or something like that. And then, so you will come up with a strategy and say, okay, I'm going to study for 1 hour per day in each of my classes, for each of my classes. Basically, let's just say 5 days a week. And so eventually, if at the end of the semester, students did indeed score an A for every single one of their courses, they actually said, look, that was the consequences. I actually scored an A in my class, in all my classes actually. And so what happened is through operant conditioning, the students said, look, my behavior in the future are going to be shaped by those consequences. So I determined that my daily study strategy indeed helped me to reach my goal, and therefore I will continue to behave in this way so I can score A's in future classes. So that is what's known as operant conditioning. So here's an example of Thorndike's law of effect. Okay, and this still has to do with operant conditioning. So he actually had these puzzle boxes, and he would put a cat inside the puzzle box, and then put some food outside of the puzzle box, and then the cat would start, through trial and error, basically would actually, let me not get ahead of myself, actually start trying to do things to where eventually this little doorway would open, and then the cat could actually come and eat the food. But the cat would learn what to do by putting its paw on this lever right here, would actually learn through trial and error that was the effect. Remember, that was the consequence. And then remember, that's what operant conditioning is concerned with. So that is what's known as operant conditioning, and or the law of effect. And Thorndike and the puzzle box was actually a good example of this. So you remember I mentioned, like take for instance the example of students, coming up with a study strategy that would help them to hopefully achieve their goals, their goals for good grades. Okay, and so when they determined that the study strategy was indeed helpful to them, and they're going to continue in future semesters using that same study strategy, that actually is called reinforcement. Okay, so that basically, when the stimulus or an event follows an operant, and the operant is basically the study strategy, this is just more of a technical term, but that increases the likelihood of that being repeated. Hence, I'm going to continue on with this same strategy because I was successful in it. So therefore, the reinforcement occurred of the student's behavior. So there are two types of reinforcement, though. We need to become aware of this. There's what's known as positive reinforcement, and that basically means basically the type of reinforcement that is likely that the results is that the behavior will be repeated in the similar situation because you're trying to reinforce that behavior, increase the likelihood that the response will be repeated. But there's what's also known as negative reinforcement. So basically that means the response results in the removal or avoidance or escape from punishing stimulus. So negative reinforcement can be basically, take for instance, if you did not achieve your goal of getting straight A's in a semester, then you say, okay, look, that type of study strategy did not work for me. Therefore, I am not going to do that anymore. I'm going to avoid using that type of strategy in my studying again. Well, that's right, is an example of negative reinforcement. And really quickly here, just want to make you aware of a couple of terms here, a couple of concepts here. So there's what's known as the primary reinforcer, okay? And basically that is naturally or inherently reinforcing for a species, so that can be things like food, water, other biological necessities. So that is the type of reinforcer that does not have to be conditioned. But the conditioned types of reinforcers, on the other hand, those are known as secondary reinforcers. So I just put this little chart right on here to give you some good examples of the difference between positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. So I just want to make you aware of that, and you can read these on your own time. Feel free to pause the video and look at these. Okay, now there's also what's known as punishment. So these are not like reinforcers. Punishment actually is an aversive consequence. Decreases the likelihood of a behavior is being repeated. So take for instance, if say when a child student behaves in a certain way that the parents are not do not approve of, they may be grounded or put into timeout or something like that. So that is what's known as punishment. So I did put a note right down here that punishment and negative reinforcement are sometimes confused. So just be aware of that, and we will take a look at those a little more in depth as we proceed, okay? Now on this here, there are two types of punishment. That I'm going to have you, you can pause the video and look at these on your own. Punishment by application or punishment by removal. But as I mentioned earlier, punishment and negative reinforcement are often confused. They are often switched around sometimes in the understanding and stuff like that, and confused with each other. So here's an example right here of punishment. Okay, so like take for instance punishment. A student, a person wears a warm but unstylish flannel shirt. And then the consequence is a friend says, makes a hurtful comment about the shirt, and then the effect on on that person that wore the shirt says, okay, well, I am not going to wear this shirt in the future because people make fun of me. So that is punishment. On the other hand, let's look at negative reinforcement. So, the individual wears the warm but unstylish flannel shirt. And the consequence is the person was able to avoid being cold and uncomfortable all day. And so the effect on the behavior is the person will wear the shirt more often in the future. So that's what's known as negative reinforcement because it's avoiding the feeling of being cold. That's why it's negative, avoiding avoiding some type of undesirable consequence or something like that. So keep that in mind. Negative means basically avoiding, taking away from the scenario. Whereas positive means, adding to a scenario, so a kind of like a desired reaction or something. Okay, so when it comes to punishment, though, I did list, some of the problems with punishment on the left-hand side here. I put those here. Okay. And then on the right-hand side, I said, well, okay, so we don't want to experience some of those problems, with punishment. We don't want those to be in the scenario here in our what we're dealing with. So here are some alternatives to punishment. Okay, and so definitely pause the video and read these. Just, these are mainly to elaborate upon, give you further insight, and get you thinking about some of these and maybe how you've either experienced these or used these in your own life. Okay, so we're going to take a look at, reinforcement just a little bit more in depth here. And so partial reinforcement right here basically refers to well, there are a few. So let me partial reinforcement effect. So down here below. Sorry, I could put these out of order here. That is my error right there. So please excuse that. But partial reinforcement basically means not reinforced every single time a behavior is exhibited, but just partially. And so basically, researchers have found that partial reinforcement actually can be a little more resistant to extinction than behaviors that are conditioned using continuous reinforcement. Okay, so remember, continuous means when basically getting reinforced on every occurrence of a particular response. Okay, so just keep that in mind. And so there are different types of reinforcement here, okay? And so they are what's known as fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, and variable interval. So in order to take a look, at each of these, I've actually put together some slides for you to where we focus on each one. So fixed ratio means basically a reinforcer is delivered after a fixed number of responses. So a fixed number of responses, and so a good example of that right here, mainly the lower part of this slide right here is what I'd like to show you. So basically, a fixed ratio, like take for instance, this mouse right here was fed a food pellet after every single fifth pressing of a response lever. So that's why it's called fixed ratio. Every fifth time of an occurrence, a behavior is exhibited. Okay. Now, on the other hand, a variable ratio, that's when the reinforcer is delivered after an average number of responses. Okay, so it's not fixed, but it's an average number of responses. So like take for instance, variable ratio here can be gambling. Okay, so we're playing the casino slots, so basically it's an undetermined number of pools, and so that is a variable ratio. It's not determined. Okay, so the third type of reinforcement schedule is what's known as fixed interval. And that basically, remember, interval just means a certain amount of time, basically. Okay, so basically a fixed interval is a reinforcer is delivered for the first response that occurs after a preset time interval has elapsed. Okay, so let's just take a look at an example. So a fixed interval can be a paycheck. For those of you who get a regular paycheck, take for instance every 2 weeks. Well, that is a fixed interval, every 2 weeks. Now, on the other hand, a variable interval is something that does not occur, but occurs after an average time interval. So, an example here, a variable interval schedule can be something like a pop quiz. So it doesn't show up on a regular basis. It just shows up kind of at an unpredictable type of interval. So that's what's known as variable interval because it's not predictable. And just, in order to summarize that, I did put this together for you. And this is just a reminder. So remember, fixed interval, that means a set amount of time. And then variable interval, that means a random amount of time. It's unpredictable. So I hope that helps you to, just sort of put all that together in your understanding. Okay, so we're going to shift gears here and we're going to talk about maybe some other types of learning. So latent learning refers to learning that might not be immediately evident, but then an individual might actually show their learning at a later time. That's why it's called latent. And latent learning actually occurs pretty much for you students on a regular basis in your schooling, in your studying and everything, because students generally, in a traditional class will, sit in their seat and listen to their instructor talk about, lecture about the day's, type of learning that they're looking at. And then the student will not immediately demonstrate that they know that they have that learning, that knowledge as a result of their learning, but they may demonstrate it on a quiz or an exam or something like that. Another type of learning that occurs is what's called learned helplessness. So basically, that's the phenomenon in which exposure to inescapable and uncontrollable aversive events, it produces passive behavior. So I'm just going to give you an example of that to kind of make that a little more understandable. So now most people have experienced this, but when something, take for instance, when something aversive, something bad happens on a regular basis, eventually, a person might say, look, what's the point in even trying anymore? I mean, every time I try this, it doesn't work out. And so they become passive. Well, what has occurred is what's known as learned helplessness. Okay, and then I put it, a kind of a little more elaborate type definition down below here. I said, that's the cognitive expectation that behavior would have no effect on the environment causes a person or animal to become passive. Okay, now we're going to talk about observational learning. So basically, observational learning, that means just observing and learning through one's observations. And a good example of this, being studied was what's known as the BOBO doll study. And this researcher right here, Albert Bandura, he sort of proposed that most of human behavior is acquired through observational learning, through watching others and what occurs in the environment. So he created the BOBO doll study, the experiment. So right here on the upper row right here, one of the researchers actually exhibited basically kind of violent behavior toward this doll right here, this big doll, and this was known as BOBO doll. And so she would beat it, she would throw it, would strike it with a hammer, would kick it, and then in the other room, young children were observing this. Okay, so they were observationally engaged in watching this behavior. So then when the children were allowed to come into the room, they actually exhibited the same type of behavior. See, so this little girl right here, is on top of the doll and striking Bobo. This child right here is throwing Bobo. This child here is actually striking with a hammer. And then this child here is actually kicking the Bobo doll. So that was the result of what's known as observational learning through observing. Now, I just put together this little list here for you where observational learning is most likely to occur. Now, in order to save us time here, I'm not going to read each of these, so I highly recommend that you pause the video and read these on your own. And I'm going to move on. Okay. And then we talked about observational learning, that the children imitated the behavior of watching adults and everything act in a certain way. Well, neuroscientists have, been very interested. They said, okay, well, what is the neurophysiological reason? What is the explanation for that? And so neuroscientists have determined through brain scans, while an individual basically observes any type of behavior, certain parts of their brain actually fire. Certain neurons actually fire in their brain, and they are able to kind of represent and interpret the actions of others. So basically putting themselves in the other's shoes. Well, those certain types of neurons that are in the brain that actually are actually fire up as they're observing are what's known as mirror neurons. So those neurons actually act like mirrors. So what they're seeing is actually being experienced in their own brain. So a good example of that basically is when an individual, is observing another individual, and they're able to kind of, by observing the individual, sort of feel or experience possibly what the other individual is feeling. And so take for instance, when watching someone's body language, and you might say, oh, that person seems like they're sad. Well, that is actually mirror neurons that are enabling that type of empathy to occur within you. So I hope that makes sense. And then I put this kind of longer example right here about music and mirror neurons here. I won't read this right now, but please pause the video and take a look at this example. This is an elaboration here that will really help you. And so that concludes our discussion. I realize that there was a lot of information in this video. And so the module on learning, can take a little bit, take a few repetitions for this all to sink in and start to put it all together and make sense of it. So I will see you in class.